If the peace of the deceased is disturbed, can there ever really be rest for the living?
How could they allow this to happen?
What if we are ignoring amber alerts from the dirt? What do we do with the dead? They're in the way. What if directly under your feet, there were whole communities silenced?
Those in power can decide what history is.
The past speaks. Are you listening?
Are you listening? Very, very powerful words. What you just got done watching there, that's the intro to our NBC6 special series, Hidden History. It's a series that looks at the history of Black cemeteries in South Florida and across the state. You know, Black cemeteries are more likely to be abandoned, lost, forgotten, or erased. And when I started putting together this series, I did it with keeping in mind that I wanted to have a conversation. I thought it was really important to highlight some of these historic locations, but to also talk about the history and to start having a conversation about what state these sites are in currently and what's going to happen in the future. Well, there are a lot of people working to research these locations and also working to preserve these locations. And today we want to continue this conversation. So I want to continue this conversation today with someone who was a vital part of that series, Hidden History. He's a local historian. He's also a doctor. He's also an author. Dr. Marvin Dunn is joining us today to continue this conversation. So Dr. Dunn, I want to thank you so much for joining. In the series, you were able to provide to us a lot of history about what took place here in South Florida as it relates to Black cemeteries. But this is a topic a lot of people, they don't even think about it. But how did you start researching this topic? Where did this passion for this topic come from for you?
Well, thank you for having me on the program and in the series. This hit me when I first started working in Rosewood, Florida, where the 1923 massacre of Blacks took place by a white mob. About 20 years ago, I was stumbling around, trespassing actually, on people's property, and I found the old Rosewood Cemetery, all overgrown, and it's on private property. And I became interested in who was in that cemetery, how was it being taken care of, etc. And that drew me into trying to determine what happened to the Rosewood victims, where they're buried. And in the course of the last several years, I've raised questions about just where these people are buried. And that's now an ongoing investigation as far as some ultimate resolution of that question. But it was finding that abandoned, or it was abandoned, cemetery in Rosewood that got me involved in this whole business of erased or abandoned Black cemeteries, of which there are hundreds in Florida.
When we talk about Black cemeteries, for example, there are a lot of people who have questions. Why would there even need to be Black cemeteries? But that's a loaded question with a loaded answer that's rooted in history of segregation and racism. But I want you to explain some of that history for our viewers.
Yes.
Black cemeteries, why was there even a need for those?
Because white people didn't want to be buried with Black people. They wanted to be segregated even in death. So what would normally happen is that in public cemeteries like the city of Miami, the Black people were buried behind the white people, the back of the white cemetery. This is pretty common. It was also common that when those cemeteries got filled up, like the city of Miami cemetery got filled up, it was common practice to move the Black to dig up the Black bodies and move them to another location, which is what happened in Miami as well. But the need for Black cemeteries arose because the segregation of policy at the time, and also because many Black churches established their own cemeteries. Some of those churches are now no longer in existence. The cemeteries are still there. The areas have been built up around, so the cemeteries are not even visible anymore. And the last thing is that going way, way back, people were able to bury their kin on their own property, like behind the house in the backyard. And of course, people move to other locations that leave their ancestors buried in these private lots, and they become lost. So through a series of things like that, we have lost many, many of the cemeteries holding Black people.
When we talk about, you mentioned cemeteries being buried on private lots. There was a time when Black people did not own a lot of property. They were not property owners. In that case, then what would they do with their loved ones?
I'm sorry, if they didn't own, well,
If they didn't own private property, didn't have money for a burial.
well, yes, we had burial societies that would go way, way back in Black history that would help people be buried if they were popular, had no money and what have you. The Oddfellows, for example, just one of the charitable organizations over the many, many, many decades that would help with burying people who were poor. But many public cemeteries had paupers, had an area for paupers, for poor people who couldn't afford to pay for their burial grounds. And those were the most vulnerable sites, burial sites, because as cemeteries needed more space, the pauper section would be dug up and then reused.
So when we have this conversation and we're talking about Black cemeteries, am I right in my assumption that a lot of Black cemeteries were located where Black communities were located back then?
Absolutely correct. And many of those communities are gone. For example, Lemon City here in maybe I'm getting ahead of things, but that's just one example of a cemetery that has been still there, but the community changed around it, development, other people moving in and Black people moving out. So those cemeteries, that cemetery and others like it, have been lost. The thing is, when we bury people, that was kind of an assumption that they're going to stay there forever. They're not going to be disturbed. That's not necessarily so, particularly in the case of members of the Black community, because we're more vulnerable to the vicissitudes of property ownership and who's in control of the site at any given time. One of the biggest problems has been the failure of public policy to address these problems. But maybe we'll get there someday. I'm glad the show is being done on the subject.
In our series, you had a lot of thought-provoking quotes that really sat with me even long after our interview. So I want to play one of those sound bites. So just take a listen to this.
What do you do to dead people, particularly ones who are poor and Black, who have no legal protection, who have no advocates? Where you could bury somebody 50 years ago is now an apartment building. It's now a gas station. It's now something else.
I think what you touched on in that quote of what you said is that areas change. Just because you're driving down the street and you're looking right to left and you don't see a cemetery doesn't mean that there wasn't one there at one time. And so in having that conversation, we have to talk about development and how South Florida has changed. So I wanted to touch on what are some areas were one time areas where Black people lived that ended up being changed because of development, which no longer are areas where Black people live.
The best example is what happened with the cemetery that was erased as a result of the expansion of the Alapattah community. There was a Black cemetery in that area called Railroad Shop, Colored Edition, really along Northwest 46th Street between, say, 12th Avenue and about 22nd Avenue. That area used to be Black. There was a Black settlement there. It goes back to when railroad cars were being repaired in that area. And in the 1940s, and there's a cemetery there, as a matter of fact. It had been existing for quite some time. Anyway, development led to that area being, Blacks being removed from that area by force. And then the area was taken over by white people. They basically needed a place for a white school. So Alapattah Middle School was built over the Black cemetery that served that particular community. There's also a City of Miami fire station over part of that cemetery. And you're right, you don't know driving down 46th Street, passing that school, that you're passing what used to be a Black cemetery, now covered over with asphalt.
Mm-hmm. And we did touch on that topic there about the area in Alapattah, which used to be the Railroad Color Shop edition. And we had a chance to look at some land surveys that the school district provided to us actually from that time, which do not indicate a cemetery. A 1936 map also doesn't indicate a cemetery. However, one thing that I've learned from just doing the story is that a lot of times these locations were not on maps. These locations.
Well, plus people lied. You know, why would a property owner property owner own up to having bodies on his property, recognizing all the difficulties that that's going to bring. It doesn't surprise me that the city, the county, the state, or private individuals would lie about whether or not there are people buried on property. The fact that the map doesn't show that is just another example of how well that cemetery was erased. Why have there be a question about it? Why not have somebody from the city or from the county go out with the proper detection equipment that could find out if their body's buried without disturbing the ground even, and put the matter to rest? Why just say the map doesn't show that, so let's be done with it? That site, the Alapattah site in particular, needs to be thoroughly investigated to determine if there are people buried there or not.
And I want to read a statement from the school district, because when we reached out to them, they did provide us with a statement. And I believe that we have that statement. So Jamel, whenever you have it, just pop it up. They told us, to the best of their knowledge, and after looking at the documents they were able to find, which were the land surveys they provided to us, there were no notes indicating an existing cemetery. We did ask them whether or not they've used any technology to indicate whether or not there could be existing graves at that location. And they told us they haven't done that either. So, we have been doing what we can to investigate that area and to figure out, whether or not there was a cemetery in that area. But to your point, that is one of the locations where it's a prime example that a cemetery could be erased, and erased very well.
Well, let me just say, the Minor Center for Racial Justice, which I established, will approach the school board and ask for an examination of that property. They can only say no, but since they say they don't know that there's anyone, that was a cemetery, then we'll ask them on behalf of our nonprofit to look and see if their body is buried there. So I'm glad you shared that information with me, and we'll follow up with a request to the school board to examine the property.
You mentioned earlier Lemon City, and I think that this is a prime example, like you said, of an area where development changed the landscape. And it also, in the changing landscape, erased a cemetery. And in part 2 of Hidden History, we look at the area of Lemon City. And I just want to talk briefly about that area because I think it's a little bit of history most people don't know about. But Lemon City is what is currently known as Little Haiti. But in that area, there were 3 distinct communities of Black people in that area at one time.
Correct.
And over time, that changed. Talk to us a little bit about the history of Lemon City, and then how did it change?
Right after Lemon City was older than the city of Miami. Lemon City was older than Coconut Grove. Right after the Civil War, several southern Georgia, South Carolina, Central Florida farmers moved to that area, north of what's now the city of Miami, and began farming. And very successfully so. So the Lemon City community evolved over 2 or 3 decades, and many Black people were brought in or came in on their own, obviously, to work those farms. So yes, Lemon City had 3 separate Black communities that were very, very productive. Some of those folks were landowners. And then as the city of Miami expanded north, from 20th Street, which used to be the northern boundary of the city of Miami, north, development took this area and changed it from farming to tourist-oriented industries. And the Black people who lived there for the most part moved west to what's now Liberty City.
While we're on the topic of Lemon City, I want to go ahead and show a part of Hidden History Part 2, where we talk about Lemon City and what took place with the development and how that cemetery was eventually rediscovered. Take a listen.
In 2009, construction crews unearthed human remains in this area of Little Haiti, previously known as Lemon City. Maps from the 1930s show a cemetery once stood on the property. This evidence did little to keep the site from being developed in the decades to come. But when the site was rediscovered, Pinckney and other advocates helped stop a planned redevelopment of the area. Today, this monument marks the cemetery and lists more than 500 names of those buried, one of which...
John Clark. My grandfather's name was John Clark.
Would lead Pinckney to her own hidden history.
When I looked to see where it said spouse, it said Melvina Clark. That was my grandmother. That was the person who raised me.
And who we just heard from right there, that's Dr. Indian Pickney. She also was a vital part of this series and just a wonderful lady to work with and to talk to, and just so much history that she knows about. But one of the things that she was able to tell us is that when she first became involved with trying to preserve that location after the rediscovery of that cemetery, she had no idea that her grandfather was buried there. That's information she would later find out. But it just goes to show you how important it is to make sure that these sites are preserved. In that particular case, the cemetery was located because of redevelopment. Developers were looking to build housing in that area, and that's where they were able to find the cemetery, because they were digging into the ground. But what are some of the other ways that people are able to rediscover or locate some of these lost or forgotten cemeteries outside of just redevelopment?
Well, there are public records that do show where cemeteries are located, were located, even the ones that have been since abandoned or taken over by development. So counties do have to maintain a record of the location of cemeteries to the extent that property owners make those records available to the county. And I would suggest that there are cemeteries that are identified in South Florida that would be recorded on the public record if we simply look for them. But again, I want to go back to a point I made earlier. There is a vested interest in lying about this. There's a vested interest, be it public authorities or entities or private ones. Once it's known that people are buried on your property, that becomes a very, very big issue, dealing with how to handle this, how to memorialize this site, and of course, how to make it available to people who have descendants buried on your property. So there's a great incentive to not be honest about the location of cemeteries, particularly on private land.
So we've been talking about erased cemeteries, but I want to talk now just about Black cemeteries in terms of them being neglected or just forgotten. I think a prime example is here locally, Lincoln Memorial Park Cemetery. A lot of history there, but for a long time it was neglected. You know, it was visible, it was operating, so to speak, but it was also neglected. It went through various stages of neglect. Now there's new ownership that has stepped in. And Jesse Wooden, who we also interviewed in the story, had a personal connection to that cemetery. He went there looking for his mother's grave. He was not able to locate her. He looked at the condition of the cemetery and realized that there was work to be done there. He purchased the cemetery, and now he's been working to make sure that that area is maintained. He has a full-time staff there. It's much cleaner than it was in years prior. So that's one person really taking ownership in a big way in order to make sure a site is preserved, but not everyone has that ability, right? So I guess when it comes to why these locations are more likely to be neglected, there's that question, and then also the question of what can be done to make sure these sites are preserved.
Well, now, what Jesse Wooten did for the Lincoln Memorial Cemetery is absolutely incredible, putting more than $1 million of his own money into bringing that cemetery back. But we can't count on the Jesse Wootens to save these cemeteries. What happens when he dies, when his fortune goes away? What needs to happen, particularly with Lincoln, because it holds more Black bodies than any other cemetery in Dade County, we need to have public support, continuing support from the county to maintain that cemetery. Everything that Mr. Wooten is doing is wonderful, but it only goes so far in terms of the long-range care and rehabilitation of that cemetery. So one of the things we're going to do, I intend to work with Mr. Wooten. He's a member of our board. He's been nominated to join our board for the Miami Center for Racial Justice. So maybe we can work together to get the county involved in some sort of long-term arrangement to have a trust fund that keeps that cemetery in capable and proper hands going forward.
And this is a conversation that's been happening across the state. You know, there's a statewide push, or there has been a statewide push over the last year in order to try to make sure that Black cemeteries are preserved and maintained, and to try to figure out what to do when they are rediscovered. That task force made up of lawmakers and experts. I know that you also were involved in that task force in some capacity.
I testified before, yes.
Talk a little bit about whether or not you think that is a step in the right direction. Obviously, they're a task force. They can make recommendations, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those things will come to fruition. Is it a step, or what else do you think needs to be done?
it's a half step in the right direction. And I'm not even sure that what this task force came up with is being adopted by the legislature. There's a good chance that it's not. But what the task force did that I think is credible and good is that they came up with a protocol for dealing with cemeteries on private properties and having access to those cemeteries so that we can determine who's there, if anybody, etc. What they did not do is address cemeteries on private property. And that's where a lot of these cemeteries are. And the task force did not deal with how you get the state with the proper professionals onto a private land to determine if people are buried there. They ignored that. My guess is that they probably won't do anything with it. That doesn't mean with the proposed legislation, that is, but it doesn't mean that no good came of it, because you had some of the top archaeologists and historians in the state involved ground level on this with this problem. And I think even if we don't get legislation out of it, at least at the professional staff level, that there's more awareness of the problem than there was before the task force came into being.
Mm-hmm. And I want to show people what that proposed legislation is. There's proposed legislation at the state level, and that is House Bill 1215. It's the Abandoned and Historic Cemeteries Bill. And the purpose behind it is to create historic cemeteries program and to focus on the coordination of research, repair, and restoration. But also at the federal level right now, there in Congress, there's a resolution 6805, which is the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act. That would give the National Park Service $3 million a year to put towards African American cemeteries and other burial sites. So this topic, which I don't think was a big part of the conversation maybe just 5 years ago, all of a sudden is a big part of the conversation. And there seems to be a little bit of action that people are trying to take. But in doing this story, I think one thing that became very known to me is that most of the action comes at the community level. You know, we had a chance to speak with different activists and different people who are working in a lot of different communities, but we took a trip to Tampa. And in Tampa, we spoke with a group called the Black Cemetery Network, who they have a website and they're working as a group to try to locate these sites. And as they locate them, they're putting information on their network for people to be able to see in real time and to be able to see as these different sites are located. And I think it's that type of coordination that really helps in this effort. We also went up to West Palm Beach and had a chance to speak with activists up there who work to preserve a mass burial site that's there in West Palm Beach. For you here locally, I know that you said that you are coordinating your own task force to try to deal with these issues. Talk a little bit about that, and then how can the average person get involved with that?
After the George Floyd incident, I established the Miami Center for Racial Justice with the intent to save stories that are so often buried, particularly those dealing with racial violence. And out of that, we became interested in not just justice for the living, but justice for the dead. How much more unjust could it be to be buried someplace and people don't know where you are? To have the place where you're buried paved over with concrete, or buildings put up over where you're buried. So part of our mission is to work with the state and with the county and with in this case the school board with the Alapattah situation, to bring attention to public authorities about the presence of these cemeteries and the need to do the proper assessment and memorialization of these sites. And yes, what needs to be done? We need more folks to do in Miami what those folks did in Tampa. Unfortunately, I think in Miami, it's just a handful of us that are really trying to stay on this. Enid, of course, Pinckney, and now Jesse Wooten is with us, and a handful of others. But we need the kind of activism in Miami and Miami-Dade County, that we saw over in Hillsborough. Part of the difficulty, I think, with us is that the Black communities is so spread out. You have a much more homogeneous Black community in Tampa and some of the other communities, but we were so spread out to begin with in Dade County and Miami that these pockets of Black occupation that have been abandoned, built over, are just totally erased and forgotten. So we're committed to trying to bring justice to the dead as well as to the living.
I love that. Is there any idea how many forgotten or erased Black cemeteries there could be across the state of Florida?
I've heard one estimate that there may be as many as 2,000 erased or abandoned Black cemeteries in the state of Florida. By comparison, there are relatively few white abandoned cemeteries. But if we really do the proper in-depth examination of where these cemeteries are, as I said earlier, 80% of them are going to be found on private land. And that's where the challenge lies. And that's where we need the legislation to allow us to have access to those properties.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Dunn, I really want to thank you. This has been, for me, more of a passion project than anything else. You know, when I first got into this, I thought it was an interesting topic, but I would say halfway through filming this, I realized that this is a real issue that needs to be addressed, and people need to take a hard look at what we can do to preserve these sites, because this is history, this is our history, and it's really important. For anyone who hasn't seen the series Hidden History, you can watch it on the NBC6 app, on Roku, Apple TV, and all of our streaming platforms, Fire TV also. And check it out. It's 3 parts. And I think that we did our best to try to really show what this issue is all about. Now, I don't think these stories are over. I think that we'll probably do a couple more. But I do think that what we're doing is we're starting a conversation, and we're trying to continue that conversation. So Dr. Dunn, thank you so much for being with us today in order to continue that conversation. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.